In 1972, there was an attack at the Munich Olympics.
The Arab guerrillas, with their Israeli hostages, are still in the Israeli headquarters.
A Palestinian group called Black September broke into the Olympic Village. They killed an Israeli athlete and coach. Then they took 9 other members of the Israeli team hostage. By the end of the attack, all of them were dead. Some were killed by Black September. In one case at least, their body was mutilated. The others died during a botched rescue. This attack left deep scars on the Israeli psyche. So how is it that this atrocity in Munich has hit the news again because of events in a graveyard in Tunis, 800 miles away, where Jeremy Corbyn was pictured in 2014, 42 years later? Well, Tunis is the final resting place of lots of people associated with the Palestine Liberation Organization. Notably, people killed in an airstrike by Israel on Tunis in 1985. In these photos, Mr. Corbyn is standing by a memorial to the victims of that attack, which has a wreath on it.
The commemoration of those that died when the Israeli jets bombed the Palestine Liberation offices and community in Tunis, a bombardment that was condemned by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan at the time, as well as the UN Security Council, and a wreath was laid on behalf of those at the conference to all those that had lost their lives, including families and children.
But how to explain these photos? Mr. Corbyn seems to be laying a wreath on graves of men with links to Black September. Some of the dead were also known as senior Palestinian leaders, but take one of them, Mohammed al-Omari, described as the organiser of the Munich operation. Mr. Corbyn insists that this is not the correct interpretation of these photos.
I was there when the wreaths were laid. That's pretty obvious. There were many others there who were witness to that. I witnessed many other people laying many wreaths.
Did you lay the wreath?
I laid one wreath along with many other people in memory, as I've said, of all those who died in the awful attack in 1985, which, as I keep repeating, and you seem not to understand, was condemned by the whole world.
Mr. Corbyn has acknowledged there were wreaths laid by others to commemorate men linked to Black September. He says he played no part in that. People close to the Labour leader have told Newsnight it's plausible that, since he speaks no Arabic, he may have accidentally become embroiled in such a commemoration. Where does this go now? Well, Mr. Corbyn's account drew criticism last night from Benjamin Netanyahu on Twitter. But that intervention moves this into an argument Mr. Corbyn will be more comfortable with. Mr. Corbyn is a long-standing supporter of the Palestinian cause and an opponent of Western intervention. A straight argument about Israel and Palestine is much easier for Mr. Corbyn to deal with than questions about whether he's been too unquestioning of his allies.
Chris Cook there. Well, joining me live from Derby is Labour MP, another Chris Williamson, who's been a strong defender of Mr. Corbyn on the whole anti-Semitism row. Very good evening to you. Look, can we just clear this up once and for all, because there has been some confusion. When the wreath was laid back in 2014, was it only laid for the victims of that Israeli bombing in 1985, or was it laid for other people as well?
Well, some people are being deliberately obtuse, Evan, it seems to me, and indulging in egregious smears against Jeremy Corbyn. And I don't know how many times Jeremy's got to make this clear, but he was there at the invitation of the Tunisian president to commemorate the deaths of the victims of the Israeli airstrike in 1985. That was the wreath that he laid. He's said that over and over and over again.
Yeah.
I know we're in the silly season, but it seems the media are obsessing about this, and certainly Jeremy's enemies are seeking to use this to try and destabilise him and to try and demonise somebody who is a man of peace.
And the way to have all of this resolved is just for sort of simple, clear answers to questions to be made, and that's very clear. So it was only a wreath for those who died in 1985. Now, what was he thinking then when he laid the wreath, apparently on the graves of 4 people who were members of Black September and who were not killed in 1985. This is the bit that we've never quite had the simple answer to.
Well, again, I think people are being economical with the truth here. The fact is that the terrorists who were involved in the atrocity in 1972 are not even buried in that cemetery.
No,
in
no,
fact,
no. But the ones, sorry, Chris, this is distraction and irrelevance. The
well, it's not distraction, is it?
The wreath was laid over four people who were
me...
not killed in 1985. Why was the wreath for people in 85 laid on four people who died in 1991 and 2?
Well, hold on a minute. There's 2 points here, I think. Firstly, let me just make it clear. It's not irrelevant because the Daily Mail smear stated that the individuals who were involved in that terrible atrocity in 1972 in Munich were buried in that cemetery. They're not buried in that cemetery. They're not even buried in that country. They're buried in Libya. Now, the other issue is about some of the officials, Yasser Arafat's officials who are buried there, who were assassinated by Israeli security forces, I think in 1991 and 1992, and it's been asserted that they had some involvement. That's always been denied, and so that is a moot point as to whether or not there was any involvement with that. Now,
thank you for that, but that is irrelevant to my question.
People are conflating deliberately.
No, right, I understand that. Now, I'll get to that, actually, but I still want you to answer the question whether it was a mistake when he laid the wreath on the bodies of the graves of the four people, whoever they were, but who were certainly not killed in 1985, whether that was a mistake or whether that was deliberate or what was going on, given that you and he have said it was all about 1985 and nothing else.
Well, that's right. And I mean, you're asserting that Jeremy laid the wreath. Jeremy was there to repeat the point.
Are you denying that he laid the wreath by the four graves?
Atrocity.
Are you denying that he laid the wreath by the four graves or not?
Well, you're making heavy weather of this, Evan, aren't you? Jeremy was there for a particular ceremony, a commemoration of those individuals who were killed by that Israeli air attack. He said he was there present when wreaths were laid, but certainly Jeremy
he laid a wreath.
Was not involved.
He said he laid a wreath this afternoon. Yesterday was when he said he was there when a wreath was laid. Today he said he laid a wreath. This is why we're all so confused.
He laid it. Well, no, well, I think people have been, as I've already said, Evan, deliberately obtuse. There was no ceremony on that occasion when Jeremy was there. There was no commemorative ceremony relating to those other individuals to which you are referring. So, you know, I think people are making heavy weather out of this and are conflating two different issues in order to make mischief. And I'm disappointed in the BBC
I'll tell you
that
why.
you are indulging this.
No, I'll tell you why, because you're being mildly disingenuous on this. We basically, it seems we have pictures...
I'm being disingenuous.
No, wait. We basically have pictures of your party leader laying a wreath on the tombs of four people who, three of whom were members of Black September, the fourth probably also associated or linked with Black September, two probably can be linked to the Munich massacre. They weren't there. I agree they weren't there, but can be linked to it. And Black September, the group which three or four of them were in, was responsible for the Munich massacre. Now, if you can't see why, for some people, that is not an important issue, I'm sorry, but it is an important issue to some people, and it's not unreasonable to ask you for a simple question, why did he lay a wreath there? It appears we have photographic evidence that he did. It's that simple.
It appears, and you know, you're putting all sorts of interpretations on it.
You're welcome to deny it. It's a bit rich, Evan. Then deny it, but you're not denying it.
It's a bit rich.
Go on.
It's a bit rich, Evan, for you to accuse me of disingenuousness when, you know, I think the BBC is being disingenuous and whole swathes of the media are being disingenuous. Because what you're trying to do, or what you're playing into the hands of those individuals, or seeking to demonise Jeremy Corbyn and imply that in some way he supports violence, that he is a friend of terrorists, is absolutely outrageous to make such a assertion. Because Jeremy's record speaks for itself. He spent his entire life campaigning for peace in the Middle East, in Northern Ireland, around the world. And for a man of peace to be demonised in this way, on the BBC, of all broadcast stations, to be, you know, indulging these enemies of Jeremy Corbyn, it's frankly unacceptable, Evan, and I'm surprised that you're indulging them in this way.
We'd all like to move on, believe me, we'd all like to move on, but it's always been very difficult. Don't we have a clear question? But let me ask you this, would you lay a wreath? Would you lay a wreath at the tombs of those four, the four where Jeremy Corbyn was photographed holding a wreath, slightly lowering himself as he had a wreath in his hand.
Jeremy, honestly, Evan, come on, you can do better than this. Jeremy Corbyn was there at the invitation of the Tunisian president to commemorate that terrible airstrike that was condemned by Margaret Thatcher of all people, and I believe Ronald Reagan and the UN, and indeed it was condemned around the world. And somehow people are trying to make mischief out of this and are conflating two separate, different ceremonies. Well, I have, but I mean, you keep coming back to it. Two different ceremonies on two different occasions. Jeremy was there for a very clear purpose at the invitation, along with other parliamentarians, I understand, for a conference. And look, you know, Jeremy campaigns for peace. He continues to campaign for peace. And there are people in the establishment, you know, vested interests who don't want to see a common sense socialist coming to power as a British Prime Minister who will transform this economy and make it work for the many, not the few, and also a Prime Minister who actually supports and understands the plight of the Palestinian people. Little wonder that Netanyahu of all people, the person who leads an apartheid regime, who ought to be before the Hague, let alone lecturing Jeremy Corbyn, a man of peace.
You can help
when Netanyahu is responsible for massacring Palestinian civilians.
You can help your party leader by just giving me a true or false. A wreath was laid by your party leader at the graves of 4 members of Black September. Is that true or is that false?
Jeremy was there to lay a wreath.
Okay, so you're unable to answer that question. You're actually unable to answer that question, and that is why this fuss goes on.
Jeremy, but no, come on. No, it's going on because the BBC and other media outlets are playing into the hands.
Well, answer the question. Is it true or false?
Jeremy Corbyn.
Honestly,
I've answered the question. Jeremy's answered the question. How
he
many
hasn't
times do you want
answered the question.
Answering, Evan. He was there to lay a wreath for the victims of the Palestinian airstrike on the PLO headquarters in Tunisia at the invitation of the Tunisian president.
But you've said that 3 times.
Can I be?
Chris Williamson, you've said that 3 times.
And you don't seem to understand the answer.
No, well, I said that in my introduction, but you're still unable to answer the question. Look, is it true or false that he laid a wreath
unable to answer what question?
Right. Did he lay a wreath on next to the graves or on the graves of 4 members of Black September, or 3 or 4 members of Black September? It's not difficult. It's very simple, and that's what people want the answer to.
Well, listen, there was the commemorative ceremony that Jeremy attended in 1985 related to the victims of the Israeli airstrike on the PLO headquarters. That's why he was there. Any wreath that was laid was for those victims.
The problem is, it seems very odd to lay a wreath on this bit if the people you're commemorating are over there in another part of the cemetery. We've both made our point so clearly. Thank you so much anyway for labouring with it. Thanks, Chris Williamson.